Hey there, listener. I want to put a little bit different disclaimer on this week's episode for you. So, everything else that we usually say is still the same. This is a podcast for entertainment purposes and not intended to provide medical advice. That's all status quo. But this week's episode is going to deal with some subject material that I'd want to tell you up front may not be for everyone. The topic of this week's episode features a sexually transmitted infection. And to discuss this, we're going to be talking about not only some of the adjacent anatomy one might have to discuss with a sexually transmitted infection, but a few descriptions of the disease itself and the indigenous culture, whose ritualistic practices included the use of bodily fluids, which might be associated with sex. So there's some explicit discussion here, which is necessary to understand how this unusual sexually transmitted infection that we will discuss affected these people. So please be aware of that before you listen on.
Cases through our history. It's just Max and there and Mike and me. You gotta listen, you don't have to read. Poor historians, poor historians, poor historians.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Poor Historians podcast. This week we are going to be doing a book biopsy episode. We were joined by author and physician Dr. John Richens to discuss his newly released book, Tik Merauke, an epidemic like no other. This book is a fascinating discussion, not only from the medical history side of things, but also from somewhat of an anthropology side of things, because we're going to be talking about an indigenous culture named the Marind, who live in New Guinea, and how a very peculiar sexually transmitted infection had unfortunately almost decimated their culture at the turn of the 20th century. Our guest, Dr. John Richens, is an international expert on Donovanosis, a sexually transmitted infection, which, as I mentioned, had such an impact on that indigenous culture. They are at the center of this book, which we are discussing today. John studied the classics and medicine at King's College, Cambridge, and King's College, London. He went on to study tropical medicine at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he became interested in Donovanosis while working as a physician in Papua New Guinea from 1984 to 1990. He went on to become an academic specialist in HIV and sexually transmitted infections at University College London, and he's a consultant to the World Health Organization. And I should say, as an expert in the matter, I think he's got a pretty authentic sounding accent. So I hope you enjoy. Oh, and I should add, you're going to notice, it's just me in this interview with Dr. Richens. So Aaron was, I believe, snorkeling off the coast of Antarctica or something, and Mike said something about trying to figure out how to stabilize a black hole in his basement. I don't know. I just haven't heard from him since, so I hope that all went well. Either way, on to the interview. I am sitting here today with Dr. John Richens, who is an expert in a topic that a lot of folks may not know about, and I know for a fact, since what I do for a living, and I didn't know much about this, that this is probably the case generally, but I would like to start by, John, asking you to kind of introduce yourself to our listener, tell us a little bit about your background, and we'll talk about what we're talking about.
I'm now retired. I started my medical career in the 1970s, and one of my early decisions was to try and find somewhere to work in the developing world. As a medical student, I went off to Côte d'Ivoire in Africa, and I just loved the work there. The doctors all multitasking, and the variety of the medicine fascinated me. And so I set out early in my medical career to acquire as many skills as I could, with the aim to going overseas. And I spent a year at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, doing a master's in clinical tropical medicine, and then looked for a job. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has got fantastic, diverse staff, a lot of them working in countries all over the world. And my mentor had worked in New Guinea and said, this is a great place to go. And if you want some help, I've got contacts in the health ministry there who can help set you up. So I took that advice and got the job as a general physician running a 70-bed medical ward in the highlands of New Guinea. When I arrived, someone came up to me and said, "Oh, by the way, there's a psychiatric ward which you'll have to look after as well," because at that time New Guinea only had one psychiatrist.
And, a true general practitioner.
Yeah. So, and then not long after that, someone else came along and said, "Oh, by the way, you're director of aviation medicine. It's your turn, your hospital. It rotates around all the handful of physicians that the country has, and it's your turn to do that." So, it was a very varied job, and I spent nearly 7 years working there, and then after I came back to England, I had to choose a specialty, which was quite a hard thing for me because I enjoyed practicing, everything except for surgery and pediatrics and obstetrics. But the obvious choice seemed to be to return to the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, and I did a little bit of research. And at that time, that was 1990, I got back. HIV was had really taken off big time.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed really interesting to me because, a lot of work I'd done has been in infectious diseases, and it was a huge problem in developing countries. So I saw there an opportunity to not only to do some research and some clinical practice in the UK, but also to start doing consultancy in developing countries, with HIV being my particular focus in those countries. So that's been my career. I'm general physician, followed by a special interest in HIV and sexually transmitted infections. And I followed that career for 20 years after I got back. And then I retired. And one of the things I thought I must finish off in my retirement is this book that I had the idea for back in the 1980s. And I've been using the subject of the book as a case study for teaching. So I started digging and looking for more information about the story, which is the basis of this book.
And speaking of which, the book I will mention here again is called Tik Merauke. And I was going to say, let's start by just kind of briefly letting the listener know, what does the title mean? What is it referring to in a general sense?
Okay, so the word tik is the Marind word for disease, and Merauke is the main town in the area where they live. Now, when the Marinds never built Merauke, there was nothing there, but the Dutch government, who were administering that part of New Guinea 100 years ago, were requested by the British government, who were administering British part of New Guinea, to sort out these Marind headhunters who were crossing the boundary into their territory and taking people's heads. And they just said to the Dutch, "You've got to do something about this." And so the Dutch sent in armed forces, they built a garrison, and they stopped all the headhunters.
Let's kind of set the scene a little bit for the listener. So Tik Merauke, referring to disease from that town. What time period are we kind of talking about here?
Right. So the Dutch government built their garrison in 1902, and it was called Merauke because it's on the River Maro. And the Marind, when this epidemic struck, decided to put all the blame on the Dutch. And so they named it after the town, saying that, this disease wasn't a problem for us until you guys arrived. And so we're going to call this disease after this place that you've built, because that's where we're putting the blame. So the Dutch built Merauke in 1902, and then the epidemic took off about 10 years later. The disease started building up dramatically.
Gotcha. And you mentioned a few of the players here. So we're talking about the Dutch. Now, Papua New Guinea, the general overview, the country that this story is going to take place in. I think I think the average kind of U.S. listener may not know a lot about some of that history, and not going through every bit of it. But can you give a general sense of kind of the players? You mentioned the Dutch. You mentioned British were there too. The entire
island, the large island as it is, seems to be in the middle of all these imperial powers with the indigenous people of Merauke, who you've referred to already, the Marind, in the middle of all that. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So New Guinea is the world's second largest island. The name confuses a lot of people because there's a lot of Guineas in Africa. In Africa, you've got a country called Guinea, you've got Guinea-Bissau, and you've got Equatorial Guinea. So 3 African countries with the word Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason New Guinea is called New Guinea is because the early explorers, when they came to New Guinea, they were very surprised to find that there were people with dark black skin. They were used to Southeast Asians with brown skin and straight hair, and here was an island with people with deep black skin and frizzy hair. And so they said, these look like Africans, so we'll call this place New Guinea. But of course, New Guinea is miles away from Africa. It sits above Australia, so it's in a completely different part of the world. But a lot of, because this part of the world is doesn't come into the news, certainly in Western media very much. A lot of people are a bit confused about just where is New Guinea.
Yeah. So, and myself as well, before our interview, I was telling you, and I think a lot of U.S. connections to this area may have had a family member that was involved in World War II, in the military operations down in the South Pacific. And that might be the main place that folks would hear about Papua New Guinea, aside from just like a geography class or whatnot. And with that, let's talk a little bit next about kind of the Marind people, the indigenous people that are the center point of your book. Can you give us just kind of an overview of parts of their culture? Certainly, we're going to talk about some very unique, especially from a Western perspective, parts of that culture. But just give us a little bit of a background of sort of who these folks are and some of their culture and some of those things, as you've already mentioned, things like headhunting and whatnot.
Yeah, so the Marind lived along the coastal strip on the south coast of New Guinea, very close to the international boundary. So today there's a vertical line that splits New Guinea into 2 halves, and on the right-hand side, that's the eastern half, is the independent country of Papua New Guinea, and on the other on the western side of the line is a province of Indonesia. And you earlier on you just asked me about the imperial powers, and it's worth mentioning that at this time in history, back in 100 years ago, New Guinea was governed by 3 different European powers. So the Dutch had the western part, and then the eastern part was divided between Britain and Germany. And then after the First World War, the Britain absorbed the German part. The Australians then managed the island till it became independent in the 1970s, and then the other side, the Dutch part, then later became part of Indonesia. So that's the sort of political history of the island. Now, on the Marinds themselves, they lived along the coast. They were pretty much hunter-gatherers, so they had very rich natural resources, loads and loads of coconut trees, and then there was sago palm. They lived a lot on seafood and fish in the rivers, and there were some savanna-like areas where they could hunt wallabies. So they had a very rich, full diet.
The wallabies are adorable. Oh, are they good eating though?
Oh, wallabies are really tasty. Yeah, that was the most prized meat. Yes, wild wallabies. The reason they got into trouble with the Dutch were they were headhunters, and the headhunting is absolutely fascinating part of their culture. The early missionaries and anthropologists tried to find out why did they think it was so important to take heads from other people, and the answer they always gave was that we need the names. And this made people scratch their heads a little bit. What do you need the names for? And they said, well, when we take a head, we ask the victim their name before we decapitate them, and that name is then preserved and given to one of our children. And this is the way we operate. This is essential that every individual is given a head name. I mean, that doesn't mean every individual had to have a victim to give them the name. I think the names probably were shared out a little bit, but that was the essence of their headhunting. And they went on a raid. They went on an expedition once a year when the season was right, and they would go off in huge war parties. Sometimes, there'd be hundreds of them in their canoes going along the coast, out of their own territory into neighbouring places. And then they would surround a village in the night, and then in the early morning they would go yelling and into the village and take as many heads as they could take.
We get sort of a almost Hollywood view of things like this, and to read about kind of the depth of the ritual was very interesting. It really did change kind of how I certainly thought about it, and it was a really revered. Is kind of I don't know how to say this, but like the beheadings were sort of a respectful spiritual thing. Am I characterizing that broadly correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't warfare. It was ritual, and in fact, the headhunting raid was a culmination of a whole series of special ritual activity, and it was a sort of culmination of an annual cycle of rituals, and so. And there was a lot of paraphernalia associated with headhunting that made it very clear that this was ritual. And they didn't regard it as warfare at all. They regarded it as hunting, but instead of hunting wallabies, they were hunting humans. But, their view of the world, they didn't see a lot of distinction between humans and their environment, from including the trees and the animals. It was all sort of part of a whole as far as they were concerned.
And I think to that point, too, next we're going to talk about some of the very, especially from a Western perspective, unique practices of the Marind. A lot of the way, my impression from reading your book was that a lot of the things that somebody might have thought about indigenous cultures and the way that they saw the world were kind of turned on their head for me a little bit, because there's a lot of subjects that the Marind, especially whether it's headhunting or what we'll talk about next, they viewed it so differently than what makes us kind of, I don't know, squeamish about it or something like that. And it was viewed in such a different way by them. It was just very interesting, because I don't know that I've learned about another culture that sees certain aspects of our normal existence in such a unique way. And, with that, as I've put a disclaimer at the beginning of this episode, this book is centering on a very unusual sexually transmitted infection that we'll talk about in some depth here. But we need to talk about some of the cultural practices of the Marind, because it's really important to understand how this more unique and rare sexually transmitted infection was able to do so much harm to this culture. So let's talk a little bit about some of these practices that are centering around semen.
Indeed. So, I mean, it's fair to say the Marind were extremely preoccupied with the collection of semen for ritual purposes, and the way they went about this inevitably carried significant risks for disease transmission. So the semen was seen as, a life force, as it is in many cultures, but to the extent that the Marind would, for example, would smear semen onto buds of plants to make them grow. Traditional medicines often included semen. So, the sovereign remedy for a sick child was a special type of banana mixed with semen. And, the list goes on.
The spider webs. I remember the spider webs.
Yes, that's right. Those. Yes, there was the glistening in the early morning, the spider webs hanging down from the coconut palms, glistening with dew, was seen as the ejaculation of the sun on the earth to make the plants grow. And another one I quite liked was that if you were traveling in the dark and you were afraid of ghosts, then you smeared a bit of semen on your forehead, and that would protect you from the spirits. So
certainly couldn't hurt.
But the problem, of course, was the manner of collection of the semen. That semen from just one man wasn't regarded as good enough. Just a bit of masturbation and there's your semen. That wasn't accepted as good enough. You needed to pull the semen of several men, and you needed a bit of female juice, as it were, mixed in with that. So what that came down to was a number of men having sex with the same woman in succession, and she would collect that semen into a little coconut shell, and then it would be passed on to the medicine man, for ritual purposes. And so the fact that this type of kind of group sexual activity was taking place in the context of their rituals meant that there was a significant risk of diseases spreading.
And much like I kind of alluded to with the headhunting, this was not this also seems to have been extremely ritualistic. So not I don't know how to put it. This did not. My impression in reading your book was that this practice was not really a like passionate or emotional thing. This was kind of a purely ritualistic thing. Did I catch that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no evidence that they particularly enjoyed it. I think for the men, it was seen as an arduous duty to the community that they felt obliged to go along with, and for women, very much the same thing. And if you look at their myths, there are actual stories about women running away from the ritual because, they didn't like it and they wanted to avoid it. And they would jokingly refer to how horrible it was in the context of some of their myths about their ancestors who did the same rituals that they were doing.
And I think the most amazing backdrop is to take all of that and then imagine being an 18th or 19th century missionary arriving to New Guinea and meeting these cultures for the first time. They did not take it well, did they?
No. They were deeply shocked, and in fact, a number of missionaries, thought this was the worst posting anywhere, that these people showed absolutely no interest in converting. In fact, it took over 20 years before they made any conversions. And in the meantime, all they could do was try and learn the language and understand the culture, and then write letters home, saying we've seen the most terrible things going on here, so bad we can barely describe them.
And I'll tell you, even reading this in the in the modern century with a very modern kind of liberal sensibility, this was even hard for me to take in some of this stuff. But again, I want to stress that none of this was gratuitous to your book. This is important because the condition that we're going to talk about is a sexually transmitted infection, but not one that is seen in mass.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at everything that's been written about, well, we better talk about the name of the disease because it's got so many different names, and that causes a lot of confusion. So in the USA, it's usually referred to as granuloma inguinale. In Britain and Australia, we like to call it Donovanosis because it was Colonel Donovan who was the first person to observe the bacteria that caused the disease under a microscope. So you've got those two names, but then
I was going to say too, for the listener, what we call eponyms in medicine are notoriously obnoxious. So all the physicians, especially in like the 18th, 19th centuries, that would discover conditions love to name things after themselves, and it's sort of like the physician kind of marking your territory in the academic books, but we discourage it now because it doesn't describe what we're learning about. And so it's harder to remember when you just name something like Bob's disease as opposed to granuloma inguinale, which tells at least a physician or somebody familiar with the terms that granuloma, like an inflammatory or infectious condition in the inguinal or kind of groin region, right? So Donovanosis, and we did learn that in the U.S. we did learn in medical school that it's a way we can refer to this particular condition, but we definitely know it better by granuloma inguinale because it's hard to remember all those just general doctor names,
Yes, but remember that if you take the example of leprosy, the polite name for that now is Hansen's disease, because people feel that leprosy is stigmatizing and the word leper is unacceptable. So that's an example where they've switched away from the old name to Hansen, who was a Norwegian doctor.
It does sound less threatening. I agree with you.
And then the Dutch had another name. They called it granuloma venereum, which is helpful. It indicates that it's sexually transmitted. But then the other problem is you've got a disease called lymphogranuloma venereum, which is entirely different infection. That's a form of chlamydia, an invasive form of chlamydia. So with granuloma inguinale and then lymphogranuloma inguinale, endless generations of medical students have got confused between these two things because, very few have seen them.
I'm among them.
So it's really problematic. And interestingly, Donovanosis was put forward as a way to solve the problem of confusion with the lymphogranuloma by an American physician called Milton Marmel. He said, people are getting too confused between these two different tropical venereal infections. Let's call it Donovanosis. And so that was embraced by the British and the Australians and rejected by his compatriots in the USA.
It's funny. Well, as you said, you can return to an eponym if you need to, I guess, if it clears up a problem. It just doesn't always do the case. So let's this condition, Donovanosis, granuloma inguinale, let's talk a little bit about what this infection looks like. So when somebody comes, how does somebody catch this infection, and can you talk about its what we call the natural course? What happens to a person who has it who does not receive treatment?
Okay, so sexually transmitted infections, come in various guises. Discharges, ulcers, and so on. So this is very much an ulcerative disease, and the first sign of infection is usually an ulcer somewhere on the genitalia, but it could be on the anus, it could be in the mouth, as with syphilis and other infections of this nature. And the ulcer is painless. It slowly, if it's not treated, it will slowly enlarge, and you end up with what's often described as a beefy red ulcer. So they can get quite large. And then the next phase of infection is when the organism gets into the regional lymph nodes in the groins. And the main characteristic, the giveaway sign that this is granuloma inguinale, is when the infection in the groin erupts through the overlying skin and you get a secondary ulcer above the lymph node. And that's highly characteristic and a very distinctive feature of the disease.
And I'm not encouraging our listeners to do this, but you can Google images of this condition if you really want, which I did do right before this interview, because I'm pretty sure the last time I saw these things was medical school. And big fair warning, these are very graphic images, especially with advanced disease.
Indeed, and it can get worse. So in women, you can get infections spread up into the tubes, and fatal infections.
Fallopian tubes, I'm assuming.
Yeah. And fatal infections in women sometimes occur, particularly if they've got an infected cervix and give birth, and that can allow the organism to enter the bloodstream and disseminate widely with fatal outcomes. For men, the feared complication is auto-amputation of the penis, which this is, I think, the only infectious disease where this is a regular feature, not a common one, but dramatic when it occurs, and that will result.
I had to look. Well, I think actually, was it mentioned in the book? Like 1 in 50. 1 in 50.
Well, yeah,
can suffer that complication.
Yeah. I mean, there isn't enough data to put an accurate figure on it, but most people who've seen a lot of the disease have come across 1 or 2 cases like that. It's
again, Google warning. It can be done. You can Google it, but it's some rough material, I would say, especially as a guy. But the interesting thing about all this, besides just that fact alone, is that this is a very slow-moving infection, is it not? I mean, this is something where, under the right circumstances, you have it. It's rarely fatal, if I'm not misunderstanding what you wrote. It's
absolutely
rarely fatal, and it's readily curable. Well, if you have the right stuff.
Yeah. So it responds to a wide variety of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and if you see a case these days, of an early lesion, you can treat it and it'll be gone in a couple of weeks. But in the past, it's a very chronic infection. It can go on for weeks. It can go on for years sometimes. And so when the Marind were infected with it, there was no treatment available, and it would progress, and you'd see the most horrendous looking lesions. And when I worked in New Guinea in the 1980s, I mean, I saw a good deal of it, and these were people coming from remote areas who'd had it for a long time, and I saw some pretty shocking stuff, and 3 deaths from the disease that I encountered when I was working in New Guinea.
And even back in the period we're talking about, they did kind of fortunately have a treatment. Antimony is what they were using. Is that correct?
Indeed, yes. And this is
before antibiotics. Can you describe kind of what antimony is, and why would this work on this infection? I'm curious if you know. I meant to look it up, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't yet.
Well, it's a heavy metal, and it was known to the Romans.
Like Slayer or Pantera kind of heavy metal, or more Iron Maiden heavy metal?
I think you've done it. Didn't you do a podcast on mercury some time ago?
I did.
So it's somewhere. It's quite close in the periodic table to mercury. It's just a few down from mercury, I think. So the Emperor Claudius apparently used it to purge himself after banquets, and it became quite a popular medicine in the, I think, 17th century. The way to prepare it was to pour white wine into a little cup made of pure antimony, and leave it overnight, and then the antimony would leach into the wine and give you, antimony potassium tartrate, which is the drug. And that drug is called tartaremetic, which gives you a hint of its toxicity and how unpleasant it might be to take. And
emetic being vomiting.
Yeah. And in my book, the treatment that was given to people affected in the epidemic, was intravenous injections, 50 of them on alternate days, which was quite a tall order in a remote
50
area.
50 injections for one person?
Yeah, over on alternate days. So they would do the injection day 1, day 2, they would do the dressings, and then day 3, get the next injection. So it took a long spell of treatment to bring it under control.
Oh, that sounds awful. Ugh. And oh my gosh. Okay, so one of the things in your book is that and we've kind of hinted at this, but like Donovanosis it's not, we don't see a lot of it in the US. It did make some appearances, and I think it does from time to time, but this is not something we usually see on a large scale, right? So we don't see it in big populations at a time, but this particularly infected and affected the Marind, not only because I think of their ritualistic practices with semen and that kind of exposure over and over again between multiple sexual partners, but there's sort of an intertanglement of another cluster of sexually transmitted infections, which was introduced by Europeans back with initial contacts. Am I correct about that?
Yes. So it was clear to the earliest missionaries to arrive. They turned up in 1905, and they started doing house-to-house surveys to record, a number of people in families and so on. They were very good at doing demographic surveys, and they noticed right from the word go that there were a lot of women who'd never given birth, and among those who had, often they'd only had one child, and they were surprised by this. Although maybe they shouldn't have been surprised, because depopulation was being reported all over the Pacific in the late 19th century, and a lot of people were putting the blame on sexually transmitted infections. We know that gonorrhea was not seen much in the Pacific until after Captain Cook went to Hawaii, and then you had all the whaling industry coming in with a lot of the whalers finding local mistresses, and so gonorrhea took off big time in the 19th century. And we think that the Marind, it probably reached the Marind before the Dutch came to stop the headhunting, so they already had a lot of infertile women, and
And it causes this and also chlamydia too, right? So it causes this, and this is very much whether it's South Pacific, US, this is a very much a known phenomenon with these bacterial infections, is that they cause scarring within the fallopian tubes, and that can cause pretty significant, not only fertility problems, but can cause dangerous problems where you have something like an ectopic pregnancy or a pregnancy developing in one of the tubes because of that scar tissue. And so it increases the risk of that. And to imagine that, I think in your book it said, was it about 1 in 4 of the sailors in the Captain Cook era were suspected to be positive with some sort of sexually transmitted infection. So you can imagine this gets into a community that has never had this sort of thing. And then, these infections, you don't always have symptoms with them is the other problem, or the symptoms are very mild and you may not notice them. One person may have pain with urination or abdominal pain and discharge, but especially with things like chlamydia, guys don't always have symptoms, they don't always have discharge, and they don't always have any indication that they have this infection. So this can get through a population pretty quickly without a lot of folks knowing it, and it's doing damage at the same time.
That's right. It's certainly the term hidden infection is very relevant here, and it was so hidden, in fact, that people looked for alternative theories to explain the depopulation. So there was a guy called Rivers who was he made his reputation actually with studies of post-traumatic stress in World War One, and so he did a lot of work in down in the Torres Strait, which separates New Guinea from Australia, and he put forward a hypothesis that the reason that there was so much depopulation wasn't disease, but that the psychological impact of being colonized, and he said that the impact of this superior race arriving in the territory was enough to make people lose their desire to reproduce. And so his psychological theory sort of held sway for quite a long time, whereas, a few wiser heads were saying, no, look, this is going to be infection. You might not see a lot of evidence of it, but this is a hidden infection. It often does cause infertility. And so there were these two rival theories. Now, if we look at the Marind, they certainly had quite severe infertility, but they had a solution, because if the women weren't having children, they could collect children when they went off on a head hunting raid. If their neighbours had children, they would take the heads and scoop up any infants and bring them home and raise them as their own. And so
meaning they would take the heads of the adults, but take
the adults would lose their heads
just to separate those two.
Yeah. So I think anyone above the age of puberty was a candidate to have their head taken, but below that, they could be adopted. And so so that was their solution to the problem initially. But of course, then the Dutch come in, stop the headhunting, and they've no longer got this outside source of kids. And so naturally, you can imagine the ritual started to intensify in frequency, and the numbers involved probably went up. We don't know exactly what happened, but the fact that Donovanosis, granuloma inguinale, doesn't normally transmit very readily, I think there had to be quite a dramatic intensification of ritual activity, as a response, not only to being infertile, but to other things. I mean, they were very ashamed that they were powerful headhunters who had allowed the Dutch to get into their country and and stop them from headhunting. So they felt they'd offended their ancestral spirits by allowing the Dutch to desecrate their sacred groves and things. And so, that called for more ritual activity. And then, later on, they had the Spanish flu arrived, and that was a big upset to them. All the while, the Donovanosis was getting more and more frequent, and they were treating it in their traditional way, which means medicines, derived from semen. So the rituals to produce that semen, that's another reason why those rituals intensified.
Kind of feeds back into it and makes this sexually transmitted infection, which is not very good at being transmitted. It has way more opportunities to continue spreading within the population. And, one question I wasn't sure of, did Donovanosis, do we know how it got to the island? Do we think it came from the Europeans, or it seems like this is something that's seen in a lot of these tropical countries? Did it sort of just originate within the countries, or do we even know at all?
Well, we know that, the first description of the disease only came in the late 19th century, and the first the first case series came from Guyana in South America. But, once that was published, people said, hey, we've been seeing this disease as well, and you started to get accounts from the Pacific, from India, South America, all over, and the southern United States. In the southern United States, they'd been calling it a phagedenic chancroid, a flesh-eating ulceration that didn't look very like syphilis and didn't look really very much like chancroid. So they just called it flesh-eating chancroid until someone pointed out that these guys elsewhere in the world had been finding the same thing. It as soon as it was first described, people all over the world in tropical regions said, yeah, we've seen cases of this disease as well. So I think that in New Guinea, it had been endemic, from time immemorial. And certainly in Australian Aboriginal population, there was a lot of it, although they are now the first population where it's been eradicated successfully. But so I think we're looking at a disease that, goes back a very long way and was not introduced by the Dutch, certainly not introduced by the Dutch. I mean, there was no cases reported among colonial staff in New Guinea.
That was a surprising fact that I remember reading here. Now in this time period when this is really spreading and as the cultural practices of the Marind are intensifying this, what time period are we in now? This was like the 1920s or thereabouts?
Yeah, well, the peak of the epidemic, I think, was reached about 1923, 1924, about 3,000 cases being treated, among this population. It didn't number much more than 12,000 at the time.
So when this starts, in the book, there are a lot of people who come from these various imperial powers and are trying, at least my impression was, they're trying to help. They're trying to figure out how to get these resources to the Marind, and they're trying to found these hospitals and these sort of things. Can you talk a little bit about the struggles they had in that environment?
Yeah, so this is where the missionaries really did something useful. They were basically a humanitarian arm of the government, and the Dutch government were not particularly interested in providing healthcare or education to the Marind. They were in New Guinea in the hope of making it profitable, exporting
kind of a side effect of imperialism.
Yeah, and so the missionaries took the lead. They were the only people actually offering healthcare to the local people. They were very alarmed by the number of really difficult cases, which was way beyond their treatment expertise. And so they were pleading for many years for the Dutch government to do something. And the Dutch government had an official ethical policy which committed them to providing healthcare, education. And the missionaries were sort of holding their feet to the fire, saying, look, you've said you're going to be ethical. Well, we can't see much evidence of that. Get on and do something. And there was one particular priest called Petrus Vertenten who was very outspoken. He was quite a gifted journalist. He was writing article after article, and these articles were being published in Jakarta, Batavia as it was called then, and back home in the Netherlands. And he was vociferous enough to actually have a debate held in the Dutch Parliament, and they eventually, funds came through to fund a treatment campaign. So it was a rare.
And that's the days before a social media following.
Yeah,
before you could get attention that way.
This guy was he wrote some very powerful stuff, and eventually he got invited by the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, and gave talks in Jakarta, with huge audiences. So he really he did an amazing job of advocacy. And then once the money was available, then they managed to hire some very, very competent doctors to start delivering the treatment.
And there's definitely mention of more than a few, but I noticed one gets his pretty much an entire chapter, and I'm not highlighting him because we have the same first name, but Dr. Max Thierfelder?
Thierfelder, yeah.
Let's talk about him. So what does he do here?
So he's an interesting character. He's German, and he's had a tropical medical career starting in Africa. And during the First World War, he was running around with a very successful German general who was one of the few generals not to get defeated in the First World War. He was sort of running around conducting guerrilla warfare. This guy was got no supplies from Europe. He was just raiding the British Army's supply depots and spent the whole war fighting against them. And Thiervelde was with him, putting up temporary hospitals wherever needed. And so that was his background. And then, of course, the Germans were kicked out of their African empire after the First World War. So he then ends up in the Dutch East Indies, and he gets hired to do this treatment campaign among the Marind. And he arrives with his wife, who's also a doctor, and he manages to survey every single village, chart, where the epidemic was raging at its worst, to build temporary hospitals. And then he starts training up. Well, his wife does, I think, quite a lot of the training. They need nurses to give these intravenous injections. And they find there's a bunch of out of work bird of paradise hunters who the birds of paradise were a big industry at the time. There were thousands of birds being shot, and the feathers were then exported to Europe and auctioned off for women's hat industry. But in the 1920s, the first international ban on bird of paradise feather trading came in. So you had all these hunters thrown out of work, and Dr. Thiervelde says, right, let's get some of these guys and train them up to give intravenous injections. And that's how the campaign was done. I mean, it was an extraordinary feat of organisation in a difficult terrain, remote country, very few resources. But he manages to get
some of his trips inland, as you described, are these rivers, and not a walk in the park. 16 hours in a canoe kind of thing. I think at one point I remember reading about, and this is some very rough country, as it were, very jungle, lots of
the flies are absolutely terrible. Apparently the mosquitoes and the flies in the wet season are absolutely horrendous, and it was always said you could never, you always had to multitask. One hand always had to be free to swat all the flies off whatever you were doing. So
worse than even Wisconsin, which is saying a lot.
And this guy was, describes having to wade through swamps up to his chest in water. I mean, it's it was pretty heroic stuff.
It's not only that, but and this kind of illustrates an interesting misconception one might have about the Marind. But to try to make these diagnoses, this doctor, they have to do, I mean, one of the main way you diagnose this, especially back then, is you have to look, right? You have to look at the genitalia. You have to look for the characteristic ulcerations. And so everybody he's coming across, he has to diagnose all these cases, which, not that looking necessarily is hard to do, but there's a lot of modesty within the Marind culture as far as exposing themselves, even between men and women of the same culture, and this was not comfortable for them. Did I read that correctly?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they had to take a detachment of police, on the surveys, and eventually Thiervelde worked out that it was best to do the old women first, I think, he usually what happened when they arrived at a village to do a survey, half the population would flee into the woods and try and escape, and the police would be sent off to try and track them down. But it was hard work, and the population did not enjoy having the surveys done at all. They were pretty resentful until the effects of treatment started to be appreciated, and then later on you'd have families bringing people who'd left hospital early, and people would actually come seeking treatment when they saw that the treatment was effective. There were a lot of pretty suffering people that were very happy to submit themselves to treatment later on.
And he has to win that respect, correct? I mean, he has to demonstrate his goodwill. I mean, the Marind have been through so many people supposedly trying to help them, and he's up against a pretty big barrier culturally, right?
Yeah.
But he seems to succeed in that in kind of the mid-20s, correct? That's kind of when the tide starts changing.
Yeah, I mean, he does his initial survey, finds extraordinary high prevalence of infection throughout the territory, and then a couple of years later, he goes back, repeats that survey, and shows a pretty dramatic drop that they've clearly brought things under control quite quickly. Although it wasn't just giving treatment; it was also a very concerted campaign by the missionaries to outlaw all the rituals, and then there was the model village program. I think that deserves a mention, that they decided to build new villages which could only be settled in by healthy families. And the reason they built the villages initially was actually to try and win converts to Christianity, but they noticed that the young married couples in those villages, who are now wearing Western clothing and sort of had abandoned or rejected the old culture, that they were remaining fertile. And the government seized on this and said, "Oh, look, this looks like it's going to help with the control of Donovanosis. So let's roll it out right across the whole territory." And that's what happened in the end. But that upset the Marind hugely, because their old culture, they had separate accommodation for men and women, and they were now being told to live as nuclear families, in one family per hut, and that was a massive upheaval for them.
I think the interesting thing about really the whole arc of the story to this point is that as you get to the story about Dr. Tierfelter, he does amazing things. He brings this epidemic under control. He's really introducing some of the best of Western medicine at that time. It's successful, and he makes a very positive difference in lives of this culture. But when you step back to all this, my impression was that a lot of these problems, basically at the root of them, was the invasion of this culture by our Western cultures, right? So I suppose you could argue that if it wasn't for the introduction of some of these other sexually transmitted infections, which then later set the stage for this particular epidemic to be, which sounds like it was already, the condition Donovanosis was already there, the initial incursion of Western countries into this area starts this cascade of like trying to put out these fires where they arrive. Now there's, we're taking resources, we're doing these things. The Marind culture is very different than the missionaries initially going there could have possibly expected. And so then they're trying to reform, and I put that in air quotes, the culture of these people who have existed for thousands of years, I'm guessing, and if not longer. And as they keep trying to make these changes, new problems are coming up out of it. And so it starts this whole cycle of this one problem leads to another, and the fix leads to another issue that was unforeseen. And eventually, in the 20s, we get the Donovanosis under control. But look what has happened to a lot of these folks. And I wonder if no contact was ever made, these folks may have been way better off for it. Would that be your impression as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the colonial enterprise caused a massive upheaval and disruption of their culture. And in some ways, the Marind were right to call it Tik Merauke. The building of Merauke set in motion a chain of events that was disastrous for them, and so the outsiders deserve the blame for that. The only thing I think we can't blame on the outsiders was the introduction of Donovanosis. I think that was already sitting there, being transmitted at a low level and not bothering anyone in particular, and then these actions from outsiders, completely changed the whole context and allowed this sort of sporadic infection to suddenly kind of erupt on this massive scale.
It's a complicated story, right? But hey, I think let's jump a little bit ahead because hey, everything turned around in the 1920s. Everything went perfectly after that. Everybody is happy from that point. No, I don't think that's true, is it?
No. I mean, I think the Marind were hit by 4 epidemics. The first one was the infertility, probably from gonorrhea. Then you get your Donovanosis starting to take off. You have the Spanish influenza that killed at least 20% of the population, huge mortality. And then the fourth epidemic was one of depression, sort of collective communal depression at having all their traditional culture sort of swept away, being rehoused in a style that was completely alien. And so you've got 4 epidemics. And then after that, you have Indonesia taking over, a flood of transmigrants from other parts of Indonesia being planted in their midst. And then the last straw was when the Indonesians then started selling off concessions to agribusiness ventures that were removing.
And this is the palm oil plantations and things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the Marind today, they're in a pretty bad way. And I would say, things are pretty much as bad now as they were back in the 1920s when the epidemic was raging. They are, they're no longer well nourished, and they're highly discriminated against and having a very tough time generally.
One of the things I was very happy to see in your book, or to read, was that, some of these things, especially this is recent history, this isn't extremely distant. And when I read the chapter from the Marind perspective, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to include that? Because I think it was an excellent idea.
Yeah, well, there's quite a story behind that. The book was submitted to Melbourne University Press, and so it had to go for peer review. And instead of sending it to historians or medics, they sent it to a couple of anthropologists. And the anthropologists came back and said, where is the Marind voice in this story? There needs to be a Marind voice. But that was a real challenge for me because, these events took place 100 years ago, and there's very little, contemporary voice to be found anywhere in the old literature. So I then sort of went round all the contacts I had who'd done field work in the Marind territory, and very fortunately for me, there was a linguist from Australia called Bruno Olsen who had done a PhD on the coastal Marind language. And he told me that he'd been given this manuscript. Some random woman had come up to him and said, we have this typescript, it's falling apart, and if we don't give it to you for safekeeping, we're afraid it will disappear, and we think it must be something quite important. Now, we don't know really very much about it. So Bruce says, okay, I'll take that into safekeeping, and he put it in a drawer and pretty much forgot about it. And then when I said, I'm looking for this Marind voice, he said, I've got this manuscript. I'll have a quick look and see if I can see anything about the epidemic in it. And sure enough, it does get a mention. So he then scanned the whole thing and sent it to me. It was written in Indonesian. And it gave me just a completely different perspective on the whole story. He was this highly educated Marind scholar who the Dutch had singled out as very bright. They put him through university. He'd learnt many languages. And then he'd read everything that the missionaries and the anthropologists wrote about the Marind. And he was enraged. He thought, they were so disrespectful. They'd misunderstood, misinterpreted. And, he had a whole different take on the whole thing. I couldn't agree with everything he said, but I felt the anger, and it really moved me to read his perspective. But I mean, to give an example of one of the points he made, I mean, he very much wanted to blame the Dutch for the introduction of the disease and the loose morals of the Europeans for having a bad effect on the Marind. But he clearly didn't understand that infertility can arise from hidden infections, because he said, if it's true all these rituals were taking place, then why aren't there hundreds of children? If there was so much sex going on, surely there would have been thousands of extra children to prove it. And so that clearly showed he didn't know about infertility and its relationship to sexually transmitted infection. But I still think a lot of the other points he made were very valid. And the missionaries may well have misunderstood certain things. There's one particular story he insists that they'd misunderstood the name of one of the traditional dances as meaning copulating like dogs, and that this dance had been banned because they misunderstood they completely misunderstood the language. So, yeah.
Well, and there was another point. I mean, I wouldn't say one would expect a lot of laugh out loud moments from your book, which is just the subject material. But I did have a laugh out loud moment when you talked about some of the difficulty with some of the initial anthropologists and missionaries who were trying to learn the Marind culture. Is that I just loved the fact that some of these folks back then would just make up stuff because it would get a reaction, or they'd find it funny that the Westerners would believe it. And so now you've got this whole mess of like, oh man, what is true? What is being embellished? What is just being made up because the Marind thought it was funny to make it up and get a reaction. I really appreciated that, because I would like to think that a lot of cultures had the ingenuity to screw around with the people who were trying to study them.
Yeah, well, I encountered this at first hand when I was working in Papua New Guinea. I mean, New Guinea is legendary for its popularity with anthropologists. It's the great Mecca. It's got such incredible diversity of cultures. There's anthropologists all over the place, and I encountered a good many of them. And one particular phenomenon I noticed, I was in an urban area looking after my patients, and you get an anthropologist sort of coming, having done months of field work, living in a village, and just needing a break because they never got any privacy. It was expected if you lived in the village, you had to participate in everything. And this anthropologist told me that he had a friend who went back to the area he'd done his field work, 15, 20 years later, to have a chat. He particularly wanted to seek out his key informant, and the key informant, they had a few drinks together, and then the key informant said, how much what he'd told him at the time was made up, just to get, so that the informant and his mates could have a good laugh at the gullibility of the anthropologist. And this guy was absolutely heartbroken to, that this guy that he thought was such a wonderful informant, had been having him on.
I love the shift in the power dynamic too. You think, I'm the scientist or the anthropologist. I'm studying these people, and the people are making fun of you the whole time. I love that. That is so human. That has to transcend so many cultures.
Yeah, and then of course, if you're going to go around asking questions about sexual behavior, I know well from my later career that's incredibly well. How do you know who's telling you the truth? And today we use computer-assisted self-interview, in the hope that people will be a bit more truthful. But I'm sure that we still haven't discovered the perfect way to really find out.
So with that, John, I think that's a pretty good overview of the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about where folks can get the book and any other final thoughts?
So the publisher is Melbourne University Press, and it's available through all major booksellers.
Hey, listener, we'll have everything linked on our show notes. So we'll have links to the book, to the publisher, and I could not encourage folks enough to go out and check out this book. This is going to be a topic you have never studied to this degree, you may have never heard of, and we didn't even mention a lot, right? There's a lot of interesting characters that come up in this story. There's a lot of interesting, like, marooned sailors and people who make appearances within this story. You got the overview here in this interview, but there's so much more to hear and learn about this. And I think, John, you covered what could be a very difficult topic excellently. I think you were very fair in terms of portraying both sides of this and allowing the Marind as best as you could to have their own voice within it as well. And so this is a good read. This is something worth picking up. And I'll tell you, I would want to introduce this story to a wider audience. So it's been awesome having you on.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your program. I'm delighted to appear alongside podcasts like the Blue People of Kentucky, which I thought was great.
We appreciate everyone listening, and we'd love to hear from all of you out there. If you'd like to send us a message or provide feedback, we can be reached through our website, www.poorhistorianspod.com. There you will find links to all of our social media sites. We take emails at poorhistorianspod@gmail.com, and we work to respond to all posts on our various social media accounts. If you have time, please go and leave us a nice 5-star review on iTunes or on whichever platform you choose, and consider posting about the show on your social media. And if you do that, hey, feel free to tag us. Every single one of those things does help raise the show's profile, and we always appreciate when they happen. If you'd like to support the show in other ways, check out the Poor Historians merchandise, including t-shirts and mugs, by going over to our website and following the links. And with all that, this is Dr. Max with the Poor Historians Podcast, signing out. AMA.
But I should ask you, how authentic were our English accents in some of our skits? Did we fool you at all?
Didn't really think about it. It didn't jar anyway, I'll say that.
I think that means authentic. Perfect. That's the way I'm going to read it.